This is our, there we go, the recording is in progress. This is our last meeting of the 2021-2022 year. We've had 6 meetings since last September and covered a lot of different topics. And this is our final topic for the year. We're very excited about Steve Greenhouse. But before we start, first of all, I want to thank you all for having given me the opportunity to serve as president of Nyc Lera. I've enjoyed doing so and putting together the programs, and I want to thank Bill and Ayana and Dan Dashman. It's been a pleasure to work with all of them, but my term comes to an end as of today, and we will be nominating for election a new board. And for that, I am going to turn it over to Evan to do the nominations.
Thank you, Anne. I'm pleased to announce the following nominations for officers for the New York chapter of Lera for the coming fiscal year. For president, Bill Herbert, distinguished lecturer and executive director of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College. For vice president, Ayanna Blake, Assistant General Counsel at Physicians Affiliate Group of New York, PC. At PAG New York, she provides legal and strategic guidance in all facets of labor and employment law, including handling arbitrations, oversight of litigation, and advice and counsel to human resources. For secretary, Sudip Mukherjee, Senior Associate Counsel of 1199 SEIU, United Healthcare Workers East. His practice includes representation of the union and its members in labor arbitration, collective bargaining, and many other aspects of labor and management relations. And for the 25th, or is it the 30th consecutive term, Dan Dashman is treasurer. Dan is business agent for Local 798 IATSE. With that, Madam Chairman, Chair, I turn it back to you.
Okay, so do we have anybody to second that nomination? If not, I'll second it. So, and I believe with that, the new board is in.
Well, we need to call for a vote. All in favor? All in favor?
All in favor, just raise your hand on the screen.
If there's anyone opposed, anyone? No one opposed. Unanimous. No abstentions, I gather. All right.
All right. Well, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Bill to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Great. And thank you, Anne, for your service this year. It's been great working with you. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you in the fall. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Greenhouse tonight's chapter meeting. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Steve's byline because he's a reporter with the New York Times for 31 years, spending his last 19 years there as paper's labor and workplace reporter before retiring in September of 2014. He's the author of 2 exceptional books, which I highly recommend. The first, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, which was published in 2008, and his most recent book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor, which was published in 2019. While Steve may have retired from the New York Times in 2014, he has remained a prolific labor and workplace reporter with recent articles appearing in newspapers and journals, including the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, The American Prospect, and The New Republic. The topic of Steve's talk tonight is very current, which is the topic is Starbucks, Amazon, and today's youth-fueled surge of organizing. Steve will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions and comments. If you just please raise your hand, we'll be able to call on you, or if you want to use the chat function, that's fine as well. Please note that Steve has to leave our meeting at around 7, so we'll probably end the meeting around that time. And again, thanks, Steve, so much for being willing to join us today to talk about this important topic. Steve?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Anne. Very nice to be here. I'm a big fan of Lera. I'm very active in Lera nationally. Should probably be more involved with Lera locally. I'm sorry I got to leave at 7 o'clock. The Civil Service Bar Association invited me to speak at the exact same time, 6 p.m. And after long negotiations and arbitrations and mediation between Bill and them, we agreed that I speak to Lera at 6 and to them at 7. So I'm not trying to be impolite. I really hate to be rushed like this. and thanks for taking the time to hear me. I'm going to attempt to share screen. I'm not great at this, and hopefully this will work. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, so here goes. So a few months ago, when I was first invited to speak to the New York chapter, I thought I would have a very mixed message about America's workers and labor unions. The old glass is half full, or no, the glass is half empty, blah, 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 blah. But in light of several impressive developments, I now strongly believe that this is the most promising moment for American workers and American labor unions in decades, but for one problem I will discuss later. Why do I say this is such a promising moment? For decades, as many of you know, many of America's workers face stagnating wages while labor unions' membership and bargaining power slid. Back in the 1950s, unions used to represent more than 1 in 3 American workers. That slid to just 1 in 5 in the 1980s, and now unions represent just 1 in 10 workers and just an embarrassingly small 1 in 16 in the private sector. As unions in the US have declined, we've seen some rather unfortunate trends, decades of stagnation in real wages and a steady, I'm having problem. Oh, I froze. Oh, sorry. And a steady increase in income inequality. So much so that the US now has the worst inequality of the G7 nations and one of the very highest levels of income inequality among the 36 industrial nations in the OECD. And there's another unfortunate trend. The percentage of economic output going to corporate profits has reached its highest levels since the 1950s, while the percentage of economic output going to wages, salaries, employee compensation recently fell to its lowest level in 7 decades, although it has rebounded slightly recently. Whoops, didn't I say I was going to be upbeat and that this is the most promising moment for labor in 2 decades? To repeat, this is indeed a promising moment. The main reason I feel that way is what we've been seeing at Starbucks and Amazon and all the excitement that has generated. I began covering labor and workplace matters for the New York Times back in 1995, and I've been writing about workers and unions in the 27 years since. During that time, many labor leaders and workforce experts said that what workers and unions needed was for workers to get excited about labor unions and for unionization to somehow spread like wildfire. Well, what's happening with Starbucks is what union leaders and worker advocates dream of, a unionization drive that is spreading like wildfire. There was a huge breakthrough last December when the NLRB counted ballots and announced that workers at a Starbucks in Buffalo had voted to unionize. It was the first of 9,000 company-owned Starbucks in the US to unionize. Even though Starbucks CEO and co-founder and founder Howard Schultz insists that Starbucks is not anti-union, the company has fought fiercely against unionization, and that makes the unionization success at Starbucks that much more remarkable. We've seen Starbucks go from just 1 cafe unionized last December to 160 unionized, with workers at 100 more stores petitioning for elections. And literally 15 minutes ago, I got an email from the NLRB saying that they're bringing an emergency nationwide 10J against Starbucks, trying to get them to cease and desist in their anti-union efforts, asking to reinstate 7 workers and asking for a GISL bargaining order. The NLRB announced, more news. So today, the NLRB announced that Starbucks workers in Williamsburg, Brooklyn voted 10-0 unanimously to unionize, and at a Starbucks in San Antonio, Texas, voted 13-0 to unionize. So why do Starbucks workers want a union? A big reason is they want to be treated with the respect they deserve. Here are some comments from Starbucks workers. One barista: my manager texted me 4 times to find out if I'd be at my next shift 2 days after my mom died. Another barista: weeks before my 10-year anniversary, I found out I was making 30 cents less an hour than a 3-year partner. Barista in Minneapolis: cutting our hours in the face of giving our CEO a 20 million raise is egregious. It sends a very clear message. Okay, enough about Starbucks. There's this other little company I want to discuss. It's called Amazon. To my mind, if there was any company that would be totally impossible to unionize, it was Amazon. I say this for several reasons. First, Amazon is dauntingly big. It's a 470 billion a year behemoth and the nation's second largest employer after Walmart. Second, Amazon is ferociously anti-union. It's the only company I've ever heard of that puts anti-union posters in its bathroom stalls, so you're forced to look at Amazon's anti-union propaganda while you're sitting on the can. A third reason, just plain logistically, it seems overwhelmingly hard to unionize a warehouse with 5,000 or 6,000 or 8,000 workers. There were 8,300 workers at the Staten Island warehouse that just unionize. It's one thing to get a majority of the 25 workers at a Starbucks to vote to unionize. It's a whole other order of magnitude to get a majority of 5,000 or 8,000 workers in an Amazon warehouse to vote to unionize. A fourth reason Amazon seemed impossible to unionize, Amazon has humongous employee turnover. The average Amazon warehouse employee leaves after just 8 months because of all the stress, the constant monitoring, and the unrelenting speed of the work. The high turnover makes it extremely hard for union organizers to reach all the thousands of workers at a warehouse when Amazon is constantly hiring thousands and thousands of new people. But as all of you know, the Amazon labor union, founded by a fired Amazon worker, Christian Smalls, joined up with 24 current Amazon workers and managed to get a majority of the 8,300 Amazon workers at Staten Island to vote to unionize. It was the first Amazon facility in the US to unionize, and as Joe Biden would say, that's a big effing deal. That victory seemed to show that if you could unionize an Amazon warehouse, you could unionize any company or workplace in the US. The Amazon labor union success in Staten Island no doubt sent shockwaves through corporate America. All these CEOs who are certain that their companies were invulnerable to unionization must be thinking, oh shit, if Amazon can lose in a unionization drive, then we might lose too. Right now, the force seems to be with unions. To be sure, that Amazon victory in Staten Island helped spur Apple workers to seek to unionize. And no one thought Apple workers would unionize. No one thought Amazon workers would unionize. But last Saturday, we learned that Apple workers in Towson, Maryland voted 65-33 to unionize with the CWA, with the machinists, making that store the first unionized Apple store in the US to unionize. I'm told that workers at 24 other Apple stores, including at Grand Central, are seeking to unionize. The Amazon Starbucks wins are inspiring to many workers across the US, and the Apple victory too. Not only do the Amazon, Starbucks, and Apple victories show that workers accomplish something truly unusual, winning a union drive against fiercely anti-union companies, those victories also show that among young workers, there's a huge excitement about unions and unionizing. Thousands upon thousands of grad students have unionized. In April, MIT grad teaching assistants and research assistants voted overwhelmingly to unionize, 1,785 to 912 against, almost 2 to 1. Sorry. Trying to get the next slide, sorry. Even undergraduate student workers are unionizing. At Grinnell, Dartmouth, Kenyon, Hamilton, and Wesleyan, they formed unions or are pushing to do so. Ditto with thousands of adjunct professors and several thousand journalists, many of them young, have voted to unionize in recent years. Ditto museum workers in Chicago, LA, New York, and elsewhere, and many young workers at nonprofits, whether the Audubon Society or the Center for American Progress. And some video game workers are unionized, and workers at an REI store in Manhattan, and at 2 Google stores in Kansas City. And nearly 1,000 workers at Google have formed a non-traditional, non-collective bargaining union. The way I see it, this push for unionization is a cri de coeur, a loud shout that something is very broken in America's economy. Many workers feel they're not listened to. In my first book, The Big Squeeze, I wrote that unions are especially helpful for low-wage workers who often have limited educations. Unions do a whole lot to improve how they are paid and treated. Right now, however, we're seeing an explosion of unionization among educated workers. I might be sticking my neck out here, but I believe one reason all these college-educated workers are unionizing is they're extremely frustrated that they have little say, that they don't have much of a voice at work, that their companies often ignore what they have to say about working conditions. While in college, many students feel that their professors, their fellow students, truly listen to them and take their views seriously. But many college-educated workers, for them, it's a rude awakening that when they take a job in corporate America, their voice, their views are often ignored. Of course, many workers feel truly valued and respected at work, but many workers feel disrespected, their voices and concerns ignored about workplace conditions. Ever since the pandemic began, we hailed essential workers for their heroism, but many of those workers feel they've been treated very shabbily. That while CEOs and white-collar workers work safely from home and were paid handsomely, the nation's frontline workers, Starbucks baristas, Amazon workers, fast food workers, meatpacking workers, supermarket cashiers, pharmacy cashiers, delivery workers, those essential workers worked in person, often near other workers, often face-to-face with customers. They often felt their employers weren't doing enough to protect them, didn't provide them with enough PPE. I spoke to one Walmart worker who complained that her store didn't require customers to wear masks when the workers were imploring management to require customers to wear masks for the workers' safety. Remember the story of the Walmart in Worcester, Massachusetts, where just a few weeks after COVID arrived on America's shores, 80 workers at that Walmart store had contracted COVID. Remember the McDonald's workers in San Francisco, where the boss said, sorry, we don't have any face masks. To protect your face, you should use coffee filters instead. Ana Martinez, McDonald's workers in San Jose, told me that during the pandemic's early months, her managers weren't providing gloves, masks, or hand sanitizer, and didn't even have enough soap for workers to clean their hands. They're not providing us with the simple necessities to combat the virus that's right in front of us, Ana Martinez told me. Not only that, while many CEOs had their compensation soar 20 or 30% during the pandemic, and while many $150,000 a year white-collar workers were working safely from home, essential workers who often made $8, $10, $12 an hour went into work every day risking their lives. Sorry. One thing that very much angered me during the pandemic was that so few American corporations stepped up and paid their essential workers so-called hazard pay or hero pay, which means a few extra dollars an hour to reward their loyal, reliable employees for working through the pandemic, for risking their lives. To my mind, the failure to pay hazard pay showed simple contempt toward the bravery and dependability and dedication of essential workers. Many workers consider that a slap in the face. Let me talk a little bit more about why this is such a promising moment for workers and unions. According to a recent Gallup poll, 68% of Americans approve of unions. That's the highest level in more than 50 years, highest level since 1965. And among young workers defined as age 18 to 34, 77% approve of unions. That's a very promising sign for labor. In Joe Biden, Americans have arguably the most pro-union president in history. True, Franklin Roosevelt enacted more pro-union legislation, but Biden's rhetoric and attitude are considerably more pro-union. He's helped create an encouraging atmosphere for organizing and workers. Just yesterday, Biden praised the Apple workers in Maryland who voted to unionize. He told reporters, "I'm proud of them." He lauded union members as the best workers in the world, unquote. With unionized workers, Biden said, everybody's better off, and the final product is always better. Also, the NLRB General Counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, is probably the most vigorously pro-union general counsel in history. She's intent on leveling a playing field that she sees as hugely in favor of employers. She's called for making captive audience meetings illegal. She's saying it should be illegal for employers not to recognize unions when a majority of workers sign cards saying they want a union, unless the employer has a good faith reason for doubt, the so-called Joyce Silk doctrine. Abruzzo suggested she would move to have Uber and Lyft drivers declared employees rather than independent contractors. I saw today she hopes to maybe rework the joint employer doctrine. and she's urging NLRB regional offices to go to federal court and seek more emergency 10J injunctions to seek reinstatement when the board feels workers have been illegally fired for supporting a union. Another reason this is a promising moment is America's unemployment rate, which is very low at just 3.6%. And that has emboldened workers. Many workers fear that they will be fired if they seek to unionize. But with the jobless rate so low, workers aren't so worried about that. They know they can easily find another job if they get fired. More good news for unions. 2 recent studies showed that essentially 1 in 2 non-union workers say they would vote to unionize if they could. Indeed, one study by professors at Columbia and MIT found that 74% of workers aged 18 to 24, 3 out of 4 say they would vote to join a union today if they could. And for Hispanic workers, it's 75% would vote to join a union. And for African-American workers, 80%, 4 out of 5. In my book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, I sought to explain at length a disconcerting disconnect. While 1 in 2 workers want to be in a union, only 1 in 10 workers is in a union and just 1 in 16 in the private sector. So why this huge disconnect? Why is it that so many workers want to join unions, but so few are in unions? In my book, I explain that corporations in America fight harder to beat back unions to remain union-free than corporations in any other industrial nation. For 5 years, I was the New York Times European economics correspondent based in Paris. I covered corporations in France, Britain, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Spain, Italy. Corporations in those countries, they might not have loved labor unions, but they saw unions as legitimate social partners that they needed to work with to increase profits and production and productivity. In the US, there's a sharp difference. Many, perhaps most corporations seem to view labor unions as the enemy, as illegitimate, as a nuisance that they're eager to stamp out, to extirpate, to crush. I can talk for an hour to explain why, when workers seek to unionize in the US, the playing field is tilted humongously in favor of corporations and against unions. One big reason is that under US law, employers can prohibit union organizers from setting foot on company property, from even putting flyers on car windshields in the parking lot. Meanwhile, corporations like Amazon can campaign 24/7 against the union, showing nonstop anti-union videos on TV in the lunchroom and break room, requiring workers to attend meetings where anti-union consultants hold forth on the supposed evils of union. They can have managers approach workers one-on-one to press them to vote against the union. They can have all sorts of anti-union banners at the entrance and the exit. And let's not forget that the National Labor Relations Act doesn't allow for any monetary penalties whatsoever against companies that break the law. That, for instance, when companies illegally fire workers for supporting a union, they could order back pay to the workers, but no fines whatsoever to the company. That lack of penalties pretty much creates incentive for anti-union corporations to break the law. Why not break the law if you really face no penalties? The PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, would, of course, change that, but a Republican filibuster has snarled that legislation. So as I've said, this is a very promising moment for labor. All this worker anger that we're seeing, all this worker energy have created the possibility of a rebirth for American labor unions. The current wave of pro-union action could build into something far bigger, something that reverses, finally, labor's decades-long decline. But that requires something that is yet to happen, the all-out backing of the nation's strangely quiet union movement. Instead of pitching in, instead of rushing to help, most major labor unions seem to be sitting on their hands as these young workers bravely seek to unionize. It makes you wonder what happened to the notion of solidarity. Yes, several unions lent organizers to aid the effort to unionize Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama, but the assistance from other unions isn't close to what's needed. Christian Smalls, the brilliant president of the Amazon Labor Union, says that workers at 100 other Amazon facilities have contacted him to say that they too want to unionize. I keep wondering, why aren't the nation's unions rushing to help Chris Smalls? Why aren't they stepping up and rushing in to help workers at these 100 other Amazon facilities unionize? I know it's hard, but Amazon is a hugely influential employer, maybe the nation's most influential, most trend-setting employer. Recently, I interviewed Teferi Jabreh, who had been the AFL-CIO's #3 official, its executive vice president. Jabre told me, organizing at any place is too hard. In the entire history of the labor movement, it's never been easy, but that's what unions are for, to do the hard work. So far, workers at 160 Starbucks have voted to unionize. Doesn't the labor movement want to help make sure that enthusiasm and activism about unions spreads to McDonald's and Chipotle and Denny's and IHOPs and Cheesecake Factories and Outback Steakhouses and TGIFs? And it's great that REI has unionized. It's great that an Apple store is unionized, but what about unionizing Walmart and Target and Kohl's and Eileen Fisher and Eddie Bauer? I recently wrote an article for the American Prospect with Harold Meyerson about the current unusually promising moment for labor. This moment resembles a landmark moment in labor history. It was the mid-1930s, and workers in America's mass production industries were flexing their muscles and seeking to unionize. But at that time, the leaders of many craft-based unions in the American Federation of Labor had zero interest in helping those workers unionize. They looked down on mass production workers as less skilled. They were also appalled at those workers' efforts to organize all the factories, thousands of workers. They were appalled by the effort to organize all the factories workers into just one union, rather than dividing them by craft and then slotting them, pushing them into the appropriate craft union. Most AFL unions turned their backs on that fledgling movement to unionize mass production industries. But John L. Lewis, then president of the United Mine Workers, the nation's richest, most powerful union at the time, reacted very differently. Lewis could see that wall-to-wall unionization was the future, and along with several other union presidents, particularly Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, Lewis threw his weight behind this newfangled strategy to unionize mass production workers. Defying the AFL, Lewis decided to underwrite the movement of unionizing mass production workers, auto workers, steel workers, machinery workers. Lewis hired more than 500 organizers to go to Detroit and Flint, to Johnstown and Akron, to Pittsburgh and Chicago, to organize the very factory workers his fellow union presidents had chosen to ignore. Thanks to Lewis's foresight, thanks to the UMW's very deep pockets, thanks to the courage, solidarity, and organizing ingenuity of many mass production workers, a small trickle of unionization turned to a colossal wave. Union density nearly tripled over the next dozen years, from just 12% in 1935 to 32% in 1947 after World War II. One fear, or perhaps premonition, that drove Lewis was the idea that if the overall labor movement remained weak, that would inevitably erode the strength of his own mighty mine workers union. That same worry should weigh on today's labor leaders. Unions can continue stumbling along with a sliver of the workforce, but labor leaders must ask how strong and effective their unions can remain in bargaining in state houses and in Congress if the percentage of workers in unions slips from the current 10% to just 8% and then to 6% and then lower. Lewis possessed the clarity of vision and sense of urgency to embrace the moment. His motto might have been, "Damn labor's inertia, full speed ahead." That clarity and urgency are very hard to find among today's labor leaders. And today's labor leaders should be mindful that this very promising moment won't last forever. With the Federal Reserve rapidly increasing rates, recession and higher unemployment may be just around the corner. Sorry. Last week, I attended the AFL-CIO's once every 4-year convention. It was held in Philadelphia. Liz Schuler was elected to a full 4-year term as AFL-CIO president after having succeeded Richard Trumka after he died of a heart attack last August. Many of us were hoping that Schuler would make sure that the AFL-CIO and the nation's unions would step up and embrace the pro-union energy and go all in to help this exciting, youth-filled moment for unions and for organizing. The slogan of the AFL-CIO's convention was building a movement to meet the moment. Schuler boasted that we have a visionary way forward. She said the Labor Federation's priority was organizing and announced in the next 10 years, we will organize and grow our movement by more than 1 million working people. She got a standing ovation, but that would mean adding, however, just 100,000 union members a year, and that would mean growth of less than 1% a year. And as a result of that slow pace, overall union density would probably decline. I interviewed several prominent labor leaders about Schuler's plan, and frankly, they were underwhelmed and disappointed. I applaud putting out a goal, said Dee Taylor, president of Unite Here, the hotel workers union, but I think that number is too low. We have to aim much higher. In the year before the pandemic, Taylor said his union organized 22,000 workers, increasing its membership by 8% in that 1 year alone. Mark Dimenstein, president of the American Postal Workers Union, told me, I like the new emphasis on organizing. I like the slogan, organize and rise, but I think we should be far bolder. Remember, the CIO organized 2 or 3 million workers in 6 months or a year in some of its great periods. We shouldn't be doing this in an incremental way, especially when people are so inspired. We should do this in a bold way. Randy Weingarten, who many of you know, president of the American Federation of Teachers, lauded Schuler's plan, saying it was very smart to put forward a firm numerical goal, quote, as opposed to simply an aspiration. Weingarten said, sometimes it's important to put a number out there that makes it real. Is it too low, she said? Of course it's too low. Do we want to organize millions and millions? Of course. Schuler defended her 1 million goal, saying it was, quote, a goal that everybody rallies around. She added, quote, it's a target, it's a threshold that we could get every union in the Federation to buy into, which is a feat in and of itself. Schuler said this was the first time the Federation was setting measurable organizing goals that each union was expected to meet. To my mind, Schuler's goal is a lowest common denominator strategy. We're seeing thousands, indeed tens of thousands of young workers wanting to push things to the max, pushing to unionize, demanding a voice at work. And Schuler's goal, I'm sorry to say, settles for a very unambitious lowest common denominator. I thought the AFL-CIO's organizing announcement was fairly embarrassing, to tell the truth. Sorry. A prominent longtime labor official recently wrote to me, I thought the AFL-CIO's organizing announcement was embarrassing. Let's just start with Liz's admission that they set their goal as low as they did because that was the only way they can get all the unions on board. Where to begin with that? First, even if true, why would you ever publicly admit to it? Second, this longtime labor official wrote me, after just having won her first election with no opposition, why would you start your presidency believing that you need complete affiliate consensus around a goal of this importance, especially a goal so modest? In the article I wrote with Harold Meyerson for the American Prospect, we concluded today's labor leaders and labor unions have a crucial decision to make. Will they remain mere spectators to these efforts, thereby increasing the chances that this very promising moment will peter out? Or will they heed the example of John L. Lewis and join in solidarity with the most pro-union generation this nation has seen in 80 years? Will they put up the money and resources required to turn this into a watershed moment for labor? This is the first time in decades that America's workers have a real opportunity to increase their power, to reverse labor's decline after union power has steadily eroded for half a century. If organized labor fails to come in big to help, this may become the last time in US history that workers have a true opportunity to increase their power. That's the end of my remarks. I'm happy to answer your questions. And again, very happy to speak to Lera.
Thank you, Steve. Can you take down your
Yep.
slide? Great, thanks. So we have now about 25 minutes for questions. I know, Evan, you put in the chat 2 items. Do you want to start?
Sure. The first point or question I had during your early part of your remarks had to do with inequality. You were talking about inequality, but you never explained inequality between who? Between what
They usually
groups?
measure inequality between the top 10% and the bottom 9%, or the top 10% and the median 50%.
Yeah, that's
So-
what I thought.
so the-
I thought
yeah,
you would say,
yeah,
but
yeah.
the problem is
The so-called
inequality-
Gini coefficient that we once.
when you compare the workers at the bottom with the people at the top, that is not a useful comparison in my view. Useful comparison.
Evan, can we just ask questions?
Oh, okay. Wouldn't the useful comparison be between the workers at the bottom and those workers at the bottom who are not unionized? And have you really looked at the comparisons? And the other question I had is, do these election victories mean anything at all unless and until there's a collective bargaining agreement reached and that collective bargaining agreement accomplishes something?
So thanks for your questions, Evan. So I was just listening to this excellent Ezra Klein podcast with the great French economist, Thomas Piketty, who's probably the foremost expert on income and wealth inequality in the world. And he was saying the levels of income inequality in the US are just crazy. You know, CEOs used to make in the 1960s, 70s, CEOs made 20 times as much as the average worker. Now they're making 300 times as much. You know, Piketty's not saying we need total income inequality. He said total income equality. He's saying I could understand the reasons for income inequality. You want to give, people incentives to become richer and buy a yacht or a Mercedes or a piano for their kids or whatever. But he says it's insane to have income inequality of 200 to 1, 300 to 1, because those people aren't spending the money. They're just sitting on it, unless you're a Russian oligarch buying a yacht. So, so he's saying, if there were much, 70, the top 10% own 70% of the nation's wealth, the bottom 1% of Americans have 2% of the nation's wealth. So he's saying if there was more wealth, more income in the bottom 50%, the bottom 70%, it would be a more prosperous economy. They'd be spending more money rather than just sitting on it. So that's one answer. So yes, what you say about, winning union elections is of course very, very important, because unless you do that, you can't even get to the next very important step, seeking a contract. So it's a huge breakthrough to win union elections at, these three iconic companies, Starbucks, Amazon, and Apple. That's a big effing deal. And I think, a few years ago, probably none of us ever thought, we'd see a union win at Amazon or at Apple, maybe at Starbucks, because it's just 25. So now, yes, you're right. And the folks who unionize Amazon, Starbucks, and Apple realize they climb one mountain and they have another big mountain. Maybe it's a bigger mountain to climb to get a contract. And I see that on the Starbucks Workers United Twitter account website, they've started a petition asking people to sign, saying that if Starbucks doesn't bargain in good faith, we will boycott Starbucks, because they realize that, Howard Schultz, even though he says he's not anti-union, is extremely anti-union. He said, I can never see the union, really embracing the union. So, so I think a lot of these people realize, yes, we have a huge challenge ahead of us, and we have to figure out how to pressure the companies into reaching a contract. And many of you have seen the statistics that basically, more than 50% of newly unionized companies don't even reach a contract in the first year. And then the management often delays deliberately in the hope that workers will become disenchanted with the union because they don't have a contract after a year. And then management hopes that after a year, the workers will vote to decertify the union. Evan, maybe you want to sign a petition that just stop buying macchiatos at Starbucks if they don't bargain in good faith.
So does anyone else have any questions? We have a great audience here and with lots of very experienced people. So who would like to go next with a question? Okay, well, as people are formulating their question, and you can put it in the chat if you want, I would ask Steve a question. I noticed that in reading interviews with Chris Smalls and in the recent article about one of the leading organizers at Starbucks in Buffalo, a tremendous degree of sophistication by these relatively young workers about unions, how to unionize, and a reading list of very, very old texts and real seriousness. So one question I have is, how prominent is that, this degree of sophistication among these new young workers? And also, where does it come from? Because seems to be something, for at least where I sit, some relatively new, this level of deep understanding about the mechanics and the issues that are needed for an organizing campaign.
That's a great question, Professor Bill. Thank you. So, there are many things going on. I wrote this article for The Guardian's, the business editor there asked me to explain why has the Starbucks campaign taken off like wildfire, while Amazon, they succeed at one place and they lost at the second place in Staten Island, and we're waiting to hear back on a final count in Bessemer, but we haven't seen a petition at any other Amazon facilities. And Starbucks workers are generally better educated than people at many other places. It's a hip place, it's a progressive place. When I was working on that story, I was interviewing one worker in Buffalo who had an epiphany for me. He said, usually it's much harder for unions to win in the South because of right to work and so anti-union. But in the South, Starbucks is seen as a progressive employer that welcomes, LGBTQ people and progressive people and people who wear tattoos and have tattoos and purple hair. So, there's a progressive, more iconoclastic, more, stick it to the man workforce at Starbucks in the South. So so we've often, we've seen these huge majorities in many Starbucks in the South. So at Amazon, Christian Smalls, Derek Palmer, and his best friend, Derek Palmer. Christian Smalls was fired. Derek continues to work at Starbucks in Staten Island. They're both very smart guys. They're both community college dropouts. In my book, I write about, a lot of the best rank and file workers, union leaders, are people who went to community college. They're planning to go for a 4-year degree. Economic exigencies drove up. They had a kid, and all of a sudden they had to drop out. And they went to work, and they saw that work often sucks, pardon my French, and they're smart people with real agency, and they don't want to put up with anyone's bunk, and they start organizing. So I think that's what happened, with Amazon Staten Island, and people, and some, in the 1930s, as most of unions sent salts, college graduates, who are very lefty, communist, socialists, into the factories to help organize. At Amazon, they've kind of the self-starting salts. They see, oh, I read about this guy, Christian Smalls. I love what he's doing. I'm going to go work at Amazon in Staten Island, and I'm going to help make it happen. So, this guy, Connor Spence, who, college, he was going to go to graduate school. He didn't get into journalism school, lucky guy. And he went to work at Amazon. And, so there's this amazing story about him. Dave Jameson in the Huffington Post wrote it, that Connor Spence went around systematically to expose the anti-union consultants, and he'd get their names, he'd get their pictures, and he put that on Twitter and on Instagram and say, these people are going around making nice inside the warehouse, just talking you out, just schmoozing, but these are anti-union people being paid $3,200 a week. Don't talk to them. Evidently, there's this very attractive blonde anti-union consultant that a lot of the guys were like talking to, and then he said, he posted her picture, she's an anti-union consultant, be careful. So, and then this woman, Madeline Wesley, she was going to go to work for Unite here in Florida, but the main lawyer for the Amazon workers in Staten Island, knew her and said, you could do more good for workers. You could do more good for unions by going to work for Amazon Staten Island. And she became the treasurer of the Amazon Labor Union. I was giving a speech up at Smith College a few weeks ago, and a freshman comes, are we allowed to say freshman anymore? A first year came up to me and said, oh, my sister Madeline, was very active in the Amazon effort in Staten Island. She's a Wesleyan graduate, as am I. And like, then I learned that, Madeline Wesley was, really, played a huge role. I think, so more and more, and there's this, Noam Schreiber had a very good piece in the New York Times a day or two ago about Jazz Breezak, this brilliant Rhodes Scholar, University of Mississippi, extraordinary woman, homeschooled, and so she, Mississippi, she met Richard Benziger, the former organizing director of the AFL-CIO, then a well-known organizer. He was head of the effort to organize Nissan in Mississippi. She dropped by there one day. She met him. She became very wrapped up with unions. So after her Rhodes Scholarship, she got in touch with Richard, and Richard said, why don't you come to Buffalo and help organize? And she got a job as a barista. And she was, very modest, humble, behind the scenes person who helped make it happen. And now, we read about Starbucks workers at one cafe, say in Buffalo, speaking to Starbucks workers in North Carolina, Florida, or Texas, or New Mexico, saying, this is how you do it. These are the tricks that the anti-union consultants are going to use against you. This is how to, get past them. And now Jazz Bezak's kind of like teaching all these classes on Zoom, So, we're talking about thousands and thousands of people. A lot of rank and file workers like super smart, and some are book smart, some are street smart, some are just strategic smart. Some know how to are just very wise on how to deal with the boss, and as happened in the 1930s, I think a lot of smarts rise up.
So we have a hand up, Thomas Tilley. Tom.
Hey, Steve, always a pleasure.
Hi, Tom.
I wonder, do you think that perhaps what we're seeing is another symptom of the polarization of the American body politic? That if you're, I can't think of anything that's like more deeply team blue than Starbucks in Williamsburg, right? So in our blue enclaves here, like New York and Washington and California, if you get the right elements together, you can like a good employment economy and a pro union NLRB, you can make progress. But can you organize an auto plant in a red state?
Well, that's a good question, Tom. So, on one hand, 13-0 vote today at Starbucks in San Antonio. San Antonio is not the reddest city in the world, but there have been overwhelming pro-union votes of Starbucks in Jacksonville and Tampa and Oklahoma City. Some pretty red places. So, and remember, in Bessemer, Alabama, the second time around, the RWDSU, the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, is like 170, 180 votes behind, with like 450 challenge ballots. I imagine most of the challenge ballots are ballots challenged by the company. So maybe they're mainly pro-union votes. So maybe the union will eke out a victory there. So I totally share your concern, Tom. But if, let's say, Evan will say, if the Amazon warehouse in South Island gets a great factory, a great contract, if the Starbucks stores get great contracts, and damn well that Howard Schultz is going to do everything he can to prevent them from getting great contracts. But if they can get great contracts, then workers at Starbucks and Amazons and Apple stores all across the nation will say, we want that. I remember my mother used to tell me the story that when she was a kid in the 1930s, she and her friends and parents would say, oh, look what that union won. We want that. We want to be a union member. And I think that that sentiment was lost for several decades. As UAW wages did not go up very high. So it's kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom and let them bloom first in the where they're going to bloom, and a lot are in the blue states. And if people get good contracts in the blue states, people will try in the red states too. Virginia, has like 10 unionized Starbucks. It's spreading like wildfire in Virginia. Maybe one says Virginia is no longer a red state. I don't know. And and in Arizona and in Starbucks is exceptional. But my feeling is, if you can, yes, it would be easier to unionize Starbucks because of the kind of tattoo-wearing, blue-haired workforce. But I imagine a lot of the workers at McDonald's and Taco Bell and Chipotle, who will be disproportionately African-American and disproportionately Hispanic, I imagine a lot of them would be very sympathetic to unions. They're probably more scared about being fired because they don't have the higher education that many Starbucks workers have. And the more educated you are, the less worried you have to be that you're really up S Creek without a paddle if you're fired. But I think a lot of Latino and African American workers see how hard it can be, and I think they're more maybe they want unions more, but they're probably more scared of forming unions. So we are in this critical moment. Things are gathering force, or gelling, and it'll be I keep wondering and asking union leaders, why aren't you encouraging this movement to jump from Starbucks to McDonald's to Chipotle? And the SEIU people tell me, well, don't forget, 93% of McDonald's are franchise. And if you organize, this McDonald's, you're not getting a contract with the parent company, just with this franchisee and maybe 5 other the franchisees restaurants. Chipotle is not franchise, and I thought that might be a good place to try to unionize. But it ain't easy to unionize, and it ain't easy to win a contract.
So Steve, we've gotten some really good questions in, and we're starting to run out of time. So I just want to maybe ask you to cover 3 different questions. First is whether the NLRB's budget is sufficient to be able to enforce the NLRA in light of all these organizing drives. It's a hot issue, as you know, about the NLRB budget. The second is the issue of Chris Brooks talking about the innovative tactics that they used during that campaign in Amazon, not relying on getting 70% authorization cards and relying on volunteer implant volunteers as opposed to professional organizers. And what do you think of Brooks's argument? And then the third is, what are your thoughts about the impact of social media in these campaigns in reaching younger workers?
Sure. All very good questions. So maybe some of you, so was it last week or the week before I went to the, CMS Stryker, the NYU Law School's annual labor conference. Maybe some of you were there. And Jennifer Abruzzo spoke. And she's a real spark plug. And, she said our budget is too low. And I tweeted out, she said our budget has been frozen since 2014. After factoring in inflation, it's dropped 25%. And again, many of you have seen the statistics that in the first 6 months of the federal fiscal year, the number of unionization petitions is up 57%, largely because of Starbucks. And then you look at all these cases that the NLRB is bringing against Starbucks and Amazon, which I submit are engaging in a lot of illegal activities. And yes, Karen Fernbach, the NLRB could use a budget increase. And I think some folks in the House are trying to, Democrats in the House are trying to win a budget increase, but the GOP wants to kill the NLRB. They want to starve it because they know that the more you can underfund it, the less effective, the slower it will be in helping unions vote and helping crack down on employers that break the law. Steve Sylvia's question about Chris Brooks. Chris Brooks is was a writer for Labor Notes. Now he does public relations, I think, for the News Guild. And he wrote a very smart article saying, we've always heard that, don't seek a unionization election unless you get 70% of the cards, because, management's going to be so effective in twisting arms once you file for an election that, at 70% support could shrink to 50% or 45% or 50 or 40%. But Chris Smalls at the Amazon Labor Union, Amazon has such huge turnover, like it's nearly impossible to get 70% of cards. So he totally turned the model on its head. And he, as soon as he got 30% cards, he asked for an election. And then they did this really smart blitz with like 24 people, and like they each responsible for like 200 people, different sections of the warehouse. And they set up their tent and they had their barbecues and they, set up shop in the break rooms, and they just did a brilliant job. And they surprised a lot of people that even if you start out with just 30%, you could still win against a humongously anti-union company like Amazon. Social media. I remember, many of you know Hamilton Nolan, terrific labor reporter. He was the guy who really started the first unionization effort in major news media at Gawker. And I remember when that began, they had a debate right on Twitter about the pros and cons of unions, and like it just caught fire, and it helped spread to Salon and Huffington Post and Slate and Vox and Vice. And social media, I believe, has really helped the unionization effort. If Starbucks fires a barista and the workers say that barista was fired improperly in retaliation for supporting a union, within 3 hours, everyone, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people across the nation know about it and are tweeting about it and protesting to Starbucks and are writing letters. Or the Warrior Met strike that unfortunately has gone on for over a year. When I was at the New York Times, it probably would have been a struggle to get even one article in the nation about a company that in Alabama that no one ever heard of, where there was a strike. And thanks to social media, there've been lots of stories about Warrior Met, and it really helps educate people about what's going on. And many of you are probably familiar with More Perfect Union, this new website and Twitter account that does an amazingly good job publicizing different labor disputes and unionization efforts. They did one recently about the effort to unionize Delta's flight attendants. It is amazingly well done.
So the final question before we let you go for your second event today is about white collar workers, any increase in pro-union sentiment. You mentioned briefly about journalists, but I think there are others as well. If you want to talk a little about, you wrote, I remember a few years ago, about unions, journalism and unions. Do you want to just talk briefly about what has been transpiring both on in the journalism world and unions?
Sure. So, Noam Schreiber, who's succeeded me as the MIT's labor reporter, had this terrific front page piece a few weeks ago about college educated white collar union movement, and he now even has a book contract on that. So I think so we're seeing a lot of educated people, journalists, museum workers, adjuncts, grad students, people at nonprofit, all these well-known nonprofits, whether Brookings or and political campaigns, a lot of educated. And I think, I have this theory that I think, a lot of educated people look for government for improvement, for like better healthcare coverage, for better childcare. And it's kind of like Walter Reuther on the Truman in the late 1940s when he sees we're not going to get improved Social Security, we're not going to get national health care from Congress, so we better win it in our workplace. And I think that might be one reason these college educated people saying things aren't good enough for me. It's hard for me to afford housing. And my health coverage isn't good enough. So they see all the income inequality, and they just feel that. And the statistics show that if you're a 28-year-old now, it's much harder than it was for 28-year-olds in 1970 or 1950 to get or a 35-year-old to get a house or have a family. And so I think a lot of, after the Great Recession, 2007, 2009, it was really, a lot of the educated people had a really hard time getting back into the workforce, getting good jobs. And so there's this frustration. And I also think that, people came of age during the Great Recession who saw it was hard for them, it was hard for the parents, just have a very different worldview from people who came of age under Ronald Reagan. And remember, there was that, who did the study? Gallup or someone that showed that a majority of Americans 18 to 21 favored socialism over capitalism. I quote that in my book. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. There was a big study, and that must have frightened the bejesus out of American corporations. And I surmise that was one of the reasons corporations announced that from now on we're going to care about all stakeholders, BS, and not just shareholders. So I think college educated people, white collar people, see there's something really broken. They don't like to see their wages going up only 2% a year when their company's spending $30 billion on stock buybacks to enrich already very rich shareholders. And they don't like, they don't love it when the CEOs are getting 25% pay increases while they're only getting a 3% pay increase. And they figure, how can I improve things? And they're looking to unions. So I should probably jump off soon to join the Civil Service Bar Association. So
on behalf of the chapter, I want to thank you. Let's all give Steve a remote applause. Thank you so much, Steve.
thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
And for those still
Good
on,
luck.
we're going to be continuing with our trying to work towards building for next year. So I just put in the chat, encouraging you to submit suggested topics and speakers and locations for events in the fall and the summer. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll be sending out another survey shortly. In the meantime, have a great summer and thank you for being involved with the chapter. Have a great evening.
Thank you.